I want you to turn to the book of Second Samuel. We're going to be going through the book of Second Samuel on Sunday evenings for the next 6 months. And we're doing this because this is the book that's been selected for the Bible Bowl. Now, for our visitors, we have such a good Bible Bowl. We have about between 15 and 20 congregations, I think, participate in this. And we've got the students, we all gather together once a month and have a test that we take over the things we've studied. And if we do real well, we can come home with a ribbon on that. And it's not really a contest against one another so much as it is as a chance to learn what the Bible says. And our young people really get into this. And so I use my Sunday nights to try to help us along with that Bible Bowl. And that's what we'll be doing now. But now for 2 Samuel. Did you know in the old Hebrew Bible, there's no 2 Samuel? We talk about 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But in the old Hebrew manuscripts, in the old Hebrew Bible, there's just Samuels, Kings, and Chronicles. There's no 1st and 2nd. And that's one of the reasons why when you count the books of the Old Testament in the old Hebrew Bible, it doesn't exactly align with what we say the 39 books in our English Bibles. Our English Bibles follow the Bible as it was divided up when they translated the Septuagint translation. And that's where the 1st and 2nd Samuel came from, translating from the Old Hebrew into the Greek. And we follow that then into the English Bible, and we're used to 1st and 2nd Samuel. But it's really one book, the book of Samuel. And you know what that means? When we come to chapter 1, we've dropped right into the middle of the story. And it'll do us well to do a quick review on how we got here. The book of 1 Samuel begins as the period of Judges is coming to a close. And it begins with a woman at the temple that is praying, Hannah, because she has no son. The judge at that time was an old priest named Eli. And I'm not going to tell the whole story, but Eli told Hannah that about this time next year she would have a son. And Hannah promised to devote that son to the Lord. Well, Hannah had that little boy. And when the boy was grown, about 12 years of age, she brought her little son. I'm guessing it says when he was weaned. Maybe it was before that. But she brought her little son Samuel to Eli and said, I was the one that was praying, and I promised the Lord he would have my son. And here he is. I just think what a heartbreaking thing it must have been for Hannah to do that. But Eli grew up in the temple under the instruction of Samuel grew up in the temple there with the instruction of Eli. And after the death of Eli, Samuel became the judge, and he served as the priest because the sons of Eli were wicked, and the Lord had them slain. And of all the judges, Samuel is probably the most godly, and we would say maybe if we were ranking them the best of all the 15 judges that we read about that judged Israel. However, and by the way, I forgot my mic. I'm going to turn this one on, and hopefully we'll be picking up out there, okay? Samuel then becomes the judge, and during the days of Samuel, the Israelites were looking at all the nations round about them, and they had kings. And they got weary of being governed by God through judges, and they wanted to have a king like the other nations round about them. I wonder if they got the same problem a lot of us in America have today, thinking, well, the government needs to take care of me. If we had a king, they could take care of me. I wouldn't have to be so responsible for myself. And that may have been part of the problem. God told Samuel, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. Nevertheless, you anoint Saul to be king. And Saul was anointed king of the tribe of Benjamin. While he stood head and shoulders above all the people. And it looked like he'd been a good choice. But as time went on, Saul showed that he did not rely on God as he should. Too many times he took matters into his own hands and did things his way instead of God's way. Samuel rebuked Saul and said, "The kingdom will be taken from thee and given to one after God's own heart." I sometimes think of that as David longing for God, David's heart longing for God. But in the context it may be it's God's heart wanting David. Either way that works. God told Samuel, "Go down to the city of Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse, and anoint David to be king." And David was out keeping the sheep when Samuel arose. He saw the other boys and thought they might make good kings. But no, that wasn't the one. It was going to be David. And David was anointed king. And then he returned to his sheep. Because Saul was the Lord's anointed, and David would wait his time to let God decide when it was time for him to assume the rule over Israel. And then we read about David showing up at the time that Goliath came. And David, that shepherd boy with his slingshot, killed that giant and sent the Philistines running. He became part of Saul's army. And the people were praising David, saying, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David has slain his 10,000s." And Saul got worried about David, and he sought his life. Now Saul's son, Jonathan, became a great friend of David, and he told David, "You need to run and flee from Saul. He's after you." And so David became a fugitive, and we talked about that this morning. He and his band of men with Saul chasing after them. I tell you, I read those stories as a young man, and it always reminded me of Robin Hood and his merry men running from King John, you know. So David's this fugitive, and he continues to be this fugitive until we come to the book of 2 Samuel, when Saul is dead. Now look how this begins. It says, well, before we begin, we've got a memory verse. Memory verse. Here it is. 2 Samuel 1 and verse 4. David said unto him, "How went the matter? I pray thee, tell me." And he answered, "That the people are fled from the battle. And many of the people also are fallen and dead. And Saul and Jonathan his son are dead also." Let's get into the story. Start with verse 1. "It came to pass after the death of Saul, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, that David abode 2 days in Ziklag." See, what's all that talking about? Let's go back and review those last chapters in 1 Samuel. David, in his running from Saul, had come into company with the very Philistines he used to fight. And there was one of those lords of the Philistines that trusted David. And the Philistines were gathered together to go into battle against Saul. And the other lords of those Philistines said, "Who is this?" And they said, "Well, now that's David. I can trust him. I'm going to use him as my rear guard." And those other lords said, "Oh, no, we don't trust him. You need to send him back." And so he sent David back to Ziklag. And Ziklag was the place where David and his men had made their home while they had this peace, this treaty, this agreement, this understanding with the Philistines. And the Philistines went after Saul. Now here's the map. That arrow pointing there to the right, that's pointing to the little town of Aphek. And that's where the Philistines were gathered. They sent David to that arrow pointing south back to the village of Ziklag. And then they went north and they had this battle with King Saul. And that's what that little sparkly thing's up there to represent, that battle. And the battle went bad. In the midst of that battle against the Philistines, Jonathan was slain. And Saul was sore sore wounded, and he knew he would die. And he saw the chariots of the Philistines coming, and he did not want to fall into the hands of the Philistines alive. He turned to his armor bearer and said, "You need to slay me." And the armor bearer wouldn't do it. "I won't lift my hand against the Lord's anointed." And so Saul took his own spear, and he fell on his spear. And when the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, the armor bearer took his life. Now, while all that was going on, David had gone to Ziklag. And when he got there, he found out the Amalekites had come out of the deserts to the south, and they had raided Ziklag. And they carried away all their wives and all their children and a lot of their stuff, and they burned the city. And the men were angry. They were even angry at David. David said, "Bring hither the ephod." And with that ephod, he was able to determine what God wanted him to do. "Shall I go up against the Amalekites?" And God said, "Go." On their way, they didn't know where they'd gone. They disappeared back into the deserts. But they found an Egyptian that was dying. "Who are you?" they said. He said, "I was a servant to one of the lords of the Amalekites, and I became sick, and they left me here in the desert to die. And I've had neither food nor drink for 3 days. So they refreshed him and fed him raisins. And he said, "Do you know where the Amalekites have gone?" Says, "Yes, and I can take you there. But don't turn me into the hands of the Amalekites." And then while the Amalekites were having their party, and they were dancing and rejoicing in the spoils of their raids, David and his men showed up, and 400 of those Amalekites jumped on camels and rode off into the deserts. And the rest of them David slew with a sword. And he brought the women and the children all back alive with many of their goods. And now he was in Ziklag, chapter 1, verse 1, 2 days. Verse 2. "And it came to pass on the 3rd day that, behold, a man came out of the camp from Saul with his clothes rent, and earth on his head. And so it was, when he came to David, he fell to the earth and did obeisance." He's showing respect for David. And the torn clothes and the earth on his head shows he's got some bad news. David said, "From whence comest thou?" He said unto him, "Out of the camp of Israel am I escaped. Pray tell me." And he answered, "That the people are fled from the battle, and many of the people are fallen and dead. And Saul and Jonathan his son are dead also." David said to the young man, now notice he's a young man. I might show up on a test. If they said true or false, an old man came David and told him that Saul was dead, you know that's false. It's a young man, okay? Then David said to the young man that told him, "How knowest thou that Saul and Jonathan his son are dead?" And the young man told him and said, "As I happened by chance upon Mount Gilboa." You know, that just doesn't sound right. How did a fella just happen by chance upon Mount Gilboa? I suspect David's beginning to get suspicious here. He says, "As I happened on chance on Mount Gilboa, behold, Saul leaned on his spear, and lo, the chariots and horsemen followed hard after him." Well, that's sort of like what we read about in 1 Samuel, but it doesn't come out exactly the same. "And when he looked behind him, he saw me, and he said, and I answered him, Here I am. And he said unto me, Who art thou? And I answered him, I'm an Amalekite." Oh boy, I bet this young man did not know that David had just chased the Amalekites down in the desert and slew them and brought them up, and now here he is, I'm an Amalekite. Don't you imagine David's getting kind of suspicious about this whole story? Now, he said unto me again, "Stand, I pray thee, upon me, and slay me. For anguish has come upon me, because my life is yet whole in me." That's sort of what happened. What's this Amalekite do? Why would Saul want to be killed by an Amalekite? He said, "I stood upon him and slew him, because I was sure he could not live after he was fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and I brought them hither to my Lord." You know, that's not what you read in 1 Samuel. What's going on here? Well, there's three explanations. There's those old skeptics, and they say, well, the Bible just contradicts itself. It's just two different sources and they don't agree, but we don't have to go there. There is this idea that maybe Saul fell on his sword and didn't really die. He just tore himself up bad and still needed somebody to kill him. But that doesn't sound right. Saul knew how to kill a man, and he knew how to kill himself. And the armor bearer thought Saul was dead and even took his own life because of that. That doesn't specifically say this. But the implication is this Amalekite's telling a lie. He's probably thinking, oh, David will be glad to know his enemy is dead. And I'll catch this crown. I'm out here. I'll get the crown and the bracelet. I'll take it to him. And maybe, see, these Amalekites are always taking advantage of a situation, and David knows their nature. Well, David took hold of his clothes and rent them, and likewise all the men with him, and they mourned and wept and fasted until even for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man that told him, whence art thou? In other words, where'd you come from? He answered, I'm the son of a stranger, an Amalekite. And David said to him, how wast thou not afraid to stretch forth thine hand against the Lord's anointed? And David called one of the young men and so go near and fall upon him, and he smote him that he died. I tell you one thing, this reminds us about David now. David. Now there's a lot we can say in honor and praise of David, but we got to remember now, David is a killer. He's quick to shed blood. And in fact, when he wants to later build a temple for the Lord in Jerusalem, the Lord's going to say, no, David, you've just shed too much blood. I don't want a bloody man like you building that temple. Let your son Solomon build that temple. David is a natural-born warrior, but I tell you, David's a killer, and he's quick to call on that sword, and we'll see that also as he is king. You know, you watch these old westerns sometime, and there's the good killers and the bad killers, aren't they? And you might say David's one of those good killers, but he's still a killer. And he does not like the bad killers that are around him, as we will see as this story progresses. But David was mighty quick to put that young man to death, and he justified it. David said unto him, thy blood be on thy head. Thy mouth has testified against thee, saying, I've slain the Lord's anointed. You see, David had respect for Saul as king because David had respect for the Lord. God had anointed Saul to be king, and you just don't turn that over yourself. David's ready and willing to let God work this out in his own time, and David did not take matters into his own hand. And David showed respect unto the Lord's anointed. And you know, if you want respect, you need to show respect. David was now the Lord's anointed. The respect he showed Saul, he had every right to expect others to show him. And indeed, he behaved himself well in this regard. But then David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and Jonathan his son. This is in parentheses in the King James Version. He bade them teach the children of Judah the use of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. The book of Jasher. And we don't know what that book is. The word Jasher can be translated the book of the upright. Sounds like a song book. When it shows up 2 or 3 times, usually associated with some event like this, and they would record events in a book that, well, it's not a canonical book. It's not a book that's supposed to be in the Bible, but it was evidently a book they had, and they were able to keep some records there. And he had this song written in the book of the upright. I think it's interesting here when he taught them the use of the bow. I usually think of that as the bow and arrow, you know. But there's another bow. there was a bow that would play an instrument. Sort of like when we play a violin or a cello. Could have been a bow like that. You know, that can be a mournful sound. And the use of that bow on a harp string like this would be a mournful sound for a mournful lament. Well, here's that lament of David. The beauty of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty fallen? If I was to give this song a title, that's what I'd call it. How are the mighty fallen? We're going to find that 3 times in this song. Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in Askelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. Those uncircumcised Philistines, David would call them. Gath and Askelon, they are Philistine villages. Don't tell it there. They'll rejoice over the downfall of Saul, is what David is singing. He says this, ye mountains of Gilboa. See, that's where Saul was slain, in the mountains of Gilboa. Ye mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew, neither let there be rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty is violently cast away, the shield of Saul, as though it had not been anointed with oil. It could be that Saul was slain as though he'd not been anointed. You'd clean those old shields up after a battle by rubbing the oil on them. The oil would make it slick, you know, where those arrows and spears and swords, they just glance off of it quicker. And this mighty shield of Saul is cast away as a worthless thing. And so he says, don't even let it rain up there. Let not the crops grow. Let not the grass grow, but let it become barren and cursed. Because there, Saul and Jonathan were slain. And then he praises Saul and Jonathan for their heroics on the battlefield. I just imagine the battles in those days. I tell you what, it was rough. One-on-one. You walk out there and you find your enemy, and then you go after him with your weapons and he with yours, and when that's through, you turn and find another. Now Saul, he's got to be an old man. He reigned 40 years. He had to have been over 20 when he was anointed king, and so he's in his 60s or maybe up near 70 years old. He's still out there fighting those battles, and that's pretty good for an old warrior like that. But this time they overcame him. But from the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, the sword of Saul returned not empty. And he says Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives. David remembers the best about those 2 men. And he says in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. You might think of the eagle as the king of birds. And the lion is the king of beasts. And these 2 warriors in their strength and might and swiftness were mighty warriors in the battlefields against those Philistines in those days among Israel. But now they're gone. And he says, you daughters of Israel, weep over Saul. He clothed you in scarlet and other delights, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. Why, Israel had prospered under Saul, and they had become rich, and the ladies, they were able to buy nice clothes and good jewelry. Those days are over now, but you owe that to Saul, that mighty warrior, for doing this. And then how are the mighty fallen? There you hear it again. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? And then he turns his attention toward Jonathan, his friend. Oh, Jonathan, thou wast slain in thy high places. I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. They weren't blood brothers, but they were brethren in heart. He said, very pleasant thou hast been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. showing that deep affection that Saul and Jonathan had toward one another. It is only in our modern times that some expositors have tried to turn this into something nasty and dirty, and it has nothing to do with this. This is David expressing his love for his brother Jonathan, and Jonathan's love for him. And their affection together was stronger than that of women. And that's not anything ugly about that. And so we shouldn't try to pervert the Scriptures to make them fit into the vile things that happen in our own day. And then he closes, how are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished. Well, what an introduction to this book of 2 Samuel. We're going to see how David becomes king. First in Hebron, later over all Israel. The mighty king that does so much good and then stumbles and falls and brings upon himself such trouble. The book of 2 Samuel will end, and David will still be king, but not for long. As we begin 2 Kings, David is going to die and turn the kingdom over to Solomon. And that's what we'll be looking at in the Sunday nights to come. Looking for spiritual lessons in all of this, I would suggest 7 things here. The unexpected problems that come to us when we lie. Lying doesn't work. Lying's not good. I'm convinced this Amalekite wasn't telling the truth. He thought something good will happen to me, and look what happened. Just don't lie. David was quick to shed blood. We brought that out. David's love for his enemy. Saul was David's enemy, but David did not hate Saul in return. In fact, David respected Saul because he had respect for the Lord's anointed. David's regard for Saul came for David's regard for Jehovah. That friendship between David and Solomon tells its own great story on its own. I didn't tell you how Jonathan shot the arrows beyond David and told the retriever, to get them, and the signal he gave David, and how they loved one another. That's its own story. But now the responsibility. It's one thing to want to be in charge, and it's a whole other thing to be in charge. It's easy to say, I want that position, but then you get that position, and now you're responsible for it. I'll tell you, all the responsibility now falls on David with this chapter, and we'll see that as it begins in chapters 2. But then also this lesson on when the mighty fall. The mighty fall. We see it among the mighty among men, great leaders of the world in worldly affairs. It's troubling when they fall, but they all fall. I've heard this used sometime in the fall of great men in the church, elders, preachers, good men that have meant so much to us, and they all fall. Death comes, and they're gone, and we feel a loss. And it's always a time of transition then, when the mighty fall. Well, Saul and Jonathan were mighty in their days, and with their fall comes a whole new situation in Israel and with David. And so we're humbled, aren't we? Sometimes troubled when the mighty fall. Now that's the lesson for the evening from 1 Samuel. I do want to point out about David. He's a complicated character. He's not going to be easy to always figure out. But you know what? We're all that way, aren't we? I think Lori has trouble figuring me out sometime after over 40 years. And I'll tell you the truth, sometimes I have trouble figuring myself out. We're complicated people. We're not simple people. We're difficult, complicated people. And things change. And we keep changing through life. I'll tell you what we can do. that'll settle us and secure us. We need to respect the Lord. The Lord's anointed now is Jesus Christ. That word Christ means anointed. We need to respect Jesus. We might be complicated. And Jesus himself is so wonderful that we can't fully grasp all that we know of him. But if we'll get our minds off ourselves and get our minds on the Lord, everything else will start coming into perspective. And so that's what I'm going to invite you to do by way of invitation. That's something we can all respond to. And if we've not been baptized into Christ, we need to be baptized into Christ and live faithfully to him. And like David, when we don't know what to do, bring hither the ephod. Let's consult the Lord. It's in his word. We'll have all the guidance we need. If you need to respond to the invitation tonight, then do it as we stand and sing.